but it usually takes a few seconds, cuts off the beginning. It's hard to skip ahead when you write a book. It's hard to, just sum it up. But I'm going to go ahead and do that with some of the details. When God was in the garden talking to Adam, and he told him that he could eat of all the trees in the garden, he said that there was one that you can't eat from. He said, every tree in the garden you can eat. And by the way, it's very important here. This is Young's literal translation. I have not found this translation in any, I haven't found this language, this wording, in any other translation, but it's really important for what I'm going to share and for what I believe. So God said, of every tree in the garden you can eat, but you do not eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, for in the day of eating it, dying, you do die. Okay. Now, the tree of knowledge of good and evil gets a bad rap. It's people think they have these other different theories about why God placed it there. At the end, I believe that the tree was placed there to be a reflection of what was going on inside the heart of Adam and Eve. I mentioned that outer dimensions and inner aspects reflect each other. And so I don't believe that this was created as a tool of torment. I do not believe that it was that it existed to give people the opportunity for free will, that in order to have free will, they had to have the opportunity to sin. I don't believe any of that stuff. I believe that the tree was actually a gracious and compassionate offering from God, that it was a mirror for the soul. It reflected the inner health of the garden's inhabitants. Okay? So that meant that if there was something about this particular tree, when you pass by, if you feel nothing, if you feel no temptation, then that means that your inner garden, all of the aspects of who you are orderly and healthy and wholly inhabited. You're a healthy person. There is nothing out there that you are tempted by. There's not some unconscious, underdeveloped, or diseased aspect of yourself or abandoned part of yourself that is craving attention or integration. Everything is in order. Okay, so there's no temptation. There's no wound exposed. On the other hand, if you pass by and you wince and you reach and you crave, then that means that there's an unhealthy aspect of yourself that needs to be worked on. So there are three ways that Eve was tempted: with her eye, her stomach, and her mind. Okay, so when she was tempted by that tree, you can imagine that if there's a damage to an aspect of us that we consider our eye, and it looks upon the tree and it sees beauty and it craves that beauty, there's some beauty that's missing inside. If we look upon it and our stomach feels a hunger for the fruit, that's another aspect of ourselves that might be unhealthy and disintegrated from the rest of us. If we pass by and we have a craving for the knowledge of the tree, okay, that's another aspect. And when you have three things, biblically speaking, when three things align against a person, that is a triangulation that usually means you've fallen fully into a trap. That's why the mark of the beast is 3 6s. I believe that each of those 6s represents, and I'm sure I got this someplace. I don't want to pretend that this is my own knowledge, but I'm sure it came from somewhere. Each of those 6s, first of all, 6 is the number of man, and each of those 6s represents a system. Okay, and if one system is social, like the church or just general society, one system is economic, and one system is political. If you have all three systems dominated by a counterfeit system to God, that is man's system, then you are a fully triangulated person. You are cornered by the social, economic, and political system that is the mark of 3 6s, the mark of the beast. Okay, so Eve was tempted in 3 ways, and I believe that that's really relevant to why the serpent showed up. So by the time we arrive in the story, there's a gap between the end of Genesis 2 and the beginning of Genesis 3. It could have been hundreds of years. We don't really know. If this is an allegorical story, if it's not literal, then it could have been tens of thousands of years. And I'll try to explain what happened in those unrecorded years. So we get to Genesis, at the end of Genesis 2, um, Adam and Eve are in the garden. I don't think I wrote down exactly the last scripture of Genesis 2, but the beginning of Genesis 3 is suddenly the entrance of the serpent. And he was crafty and subtle, we all know that. And one of the important things about this is that when he shows up, he says to the woman, "Is it true?" And I'm pulling these, I'm paraphrasing from Young's literal or from Darby's translation, which is also an 1800s translation, the late 1800s. He says, "Is it true that," he says to Eve, "is it true that that God said you can't eat from any tree of the garden, or that you shall not eat of every tree of the garden?" And here's what's so important about this passage. The author mentions God as Jehovah Elohim every time the author talks about God. If Moses wrote this or if he passed it down, great. Whoever it is that recorded this, always referred to God as Jehovah Elohim. And without getting too much into detail, Jehovah is like 95% of that. And Elohim is like 5%. So Elohim can mean many different things, many different beings. It can mean human judges. It can mean angels. It can mean powerful ones. So to refer to someone as Elohim, which is the plural for Eloah, all you're really saying is, if you said, did Elohim say? All you're really asking is a general question of, did that higher being or that judge or that those powerful beings, did they say such and such? If you say Jehovah Elohim, you're talking about the creator of the universe. There's only one Jehovah Elohim. There are many Elohim, biblically speaking. So when the serpent asks Eve, did God say this about the garden? Well, first of all, the serpent knew exactly, and I'll show that later, that the serpent knew exactly what God said. But what he did was he referred to Jehovah Elohim as simply as Elohim. That would be the equivalent of you and I being called meat bags. Are you married to that meat bag over there? Or uh, as Elon Musk describes the human existence, data storage. Oh, I see you married that store of data over there. How's that going? How's your relationship with that store of data? You'd be super offended to be like, dude, I'm going to knock you out if you keep talking about my wife in such a diminutive way. We're not having that. She has a name. She's a human being. She has many aspects, and she's multidimensional. And you will not call her a meat bag. You will not call her a store of data. You will not call her a birthing pod. That is my wife you're talking about. This is what the serpent did when he went to Eve and referred to God as Elohim. Did that whatever being, that someone probably not greater than me, tell you this and that? What we have is an identity issue. The first intention, I believe, that the serpent had in that question was to see if Eve would go along with that description and identity of God, because he knew that if she did not correct him, then her relationship with God had already fallen to such a state that she was not in relationship with the fullness of God anymore. And she was only in relationship to the Elohimness of God and not the Jehovahness. And that would mean that there were many aspects of her that were in need and having desire and craving. That was the first thing. So, his second intention. Ooh, lots of details here. I really poured it on. Let's skip the second part of this. I'm not going to tell you the second part because this is already going to be way too much. It's a book. It's a whole book. I can't tell you the whole book. It's hours. So, how did Eve respond? Did Eve respond by saying, "Hey man, watch it. That's Jehovah Elohim you're talking about. I'm not going to have that." Unfortunately, she did not. She said to the serpent, "Oh yeah, we can eat of the trees of the garden. Only the fruit of the tree in the midst of the garden, Elohim said, don't eat of it or touch it lest you die." Not only did she misquote the one rule that we know of, she referred to God as Elohim in the same way that the serpent did. And I believe at that point, the hardest part of the serpent's job was done. He knew that she was lacking and craving and was out of relationship with God. And what this suggests to me is that the fall of Adam and Eve it took place long before the serpent entered the garden or they ate of the fruit. They had walked by that tree many, many times, perhaps for centuries, telling themselves, no, we're not going to do it. No, we're not going to do it. There's things missing in us, but no, we're not going to do it. We've got damaged aspects and we're not bringing it into the light and the fresh air and the view of God. We're not taking these things to God for healing. And so they're festering and they're diseased. And that means that we're craving other things to make up for this lack that we have because we want to be whole dimensional beings or whole, uh, you know, fully integrated beings, but we haven't done it. And by the time the serpent shows up, his job was not to cause the fall, I believe, but to help Adam and Eve. Um, there's a particular word. I really wish I had it right now because it's in the book someplace. To help them accomplish the ritual, the physical ritual that would set it as done. The fall was already within them. There was just a dimension left in the world where there needed to be a physical ritual that took place to solidify this in concrete once and for all, that they could not say we didn't know. We didn't know about this this broken aspect of ourselves. We didn't know that we were in a fallen state because of, the subtleness of feelings and inner workings and the inner aspects. No, no, no. There's a physical tree right there. I told you don't eat the fruit. You chose to eat the fruit. There's no question about what you're doing. And what is interesting to me about this is that I lost my train of thought. That's pretty interesting. Eve misquotes God's one rule, but the serpent corrects her. He could have ridden on that and said, uh, God didn't say that. Or he could have said, God, that's not true. That rule is not true. He could have said, that's not true. And he could have been telling the truth. But because it was so important that what's that term for medical consent? Where you have knowledge of the consent? Anyway, um, gosh, I really wish I had that because it's right here somewhere in this writing. Not manufactured consent. Anyway, They had to consent with the full knowledge of what was going on. So even though Eve misquoted the rule, the serpent corrected her when he said back to her, God said, dying, you do die. The serpent said, dying, you do not die. There is no other translation that explains it in that way. And the reason that that is so important is because God and the serpent agree that there would be death. But God, speaking to the whole being, the complete, fully integrated person, said, dying, you, the fully integrated you, will die. The serpent, just as he spoke about God as Elohim, the small 5% of God that is Elohim, let's say, he spoke to Eve in the same way. When he said you, he wasn't talking about the whole fullness of you. He was talking about a little fraction of you, the temporary you, the physical you, not the eternal you, not the fully integrated spiritual you, but just the little bit of you that I'm referring to, just like I'm referring to the little bit of God. Dying, small you do not die. Was the serpent lying? No. Was he disagreeing with God? No. He was just addressing the smallest fraction of the human, just the same way he addressed the smallest fraction of God. And in doing so, he insulted them just as he insulted God. If I've got anything else to add to that, which there's pages and pages, I'll make another video. But I really wanted to make this video because Alex and Jordan were wrestling with this idea of, wait, God said that surely they would die, and the serpent said, surely you won't die. Well, if you read it like that, then you could say that the serpent was lying. And you could say that actually God was lying because they didn't die. So, hey, maybe this Gnostic idea that actually this Jehovah Elohim was some kind of evil demigod that created humanity and creation, and he lied to them to control them, and the serpent was actually there to set them free. And the proof is that when they ate of the fruit, they didn't die. They were just kicked out of the garden. That's how you know that God was lying, because they didn't die. He said they would die. The serpent said they wouldn't. Now that I've shown you this literal translation, you can see that God was telling the truth, and he was telling the truth to the whole being. The serpent was telling the truth, but he was telling the truth to what the part of them that would remain after the fall. All right.